Mr. Speaker, Singapore is gravely concerned about the escalating tensions in the Middle East, which have put at risk efforts to secure a ceasefire agreement in Gaza. This should be the foremost priority. Singapore firmly supports the ceasefire proposal, which was first announced by the United States on the 31st of May 2024, and was subsequently welcomed, in fact, codified by the UN Security Council resolution on the 10th of June 2024. We urge all parties in the conflict to arrive at an agreement. As the humanitarian crisis in Gaza deepens, Singapore stands with the entire international community in calling for an immediate ceasefire. We call for the unconditional and safe release of all hostages, and we also call for unhindered humanitarian access. We also reiterate our call for all sides to comply with international law, including international humanitarian law. The second point I want to make is that Singapore calls on all parties to de-escalate tensions and that there is a real and rising danger of a wider regional conflagration that needs to be avoided. We condemn all attacks on civilians, including the recent attacks across the Israel-Lebanon border, as Mr. D'Souza has alluded to. We urge all parties, with respect to Lebanon, we urge all parties to fully implement the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which, inter alia, called for the full cessation of hostilities and the establishment of a demilitarized zone in the south of Lebanon, permitting only UN and Lebanese armed forces. Mr. Speaker, I will now take the questions related to the advisory opinion issued by the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. This advisory opinion was published on the 19th of July 2024. Advisory opinions of the ICJ carry significant weight in the international legal system, and they contribute to the development of international law, even though they do not in themselves create legally binding obligations. The advisory opinion on the 19th of July 2024 that was requested by the UN General Assembly is significant. It focuses on Israeli policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the issue of Israeli settlements. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has announced that he will put the advisory opinion to the General Assembly to decide on how to proceed on the matter. Singapore's long-standing position on Israeli settlements has been clear and consistent. Singapore views the Israeli settlements as illegal under international law. These settlements make it much harder to arrive at a viable two-state solution. Singapore has consistently voted in support of UN General Assembly resolutions that reject Israeli settlement activities and call upon Israel to rescind all unilateral measures that have been taken to change the status of Jerusalem. Singapore's long-standing position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that the only viable pathway to a comprehensive, just, and durable solution is a negotiated two-state solution, consistent with all the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and we continue to urge both parties to resume direct negotiations. and to, in the meantime, refrain from unilateral actions that attempt to change the status quo, because this will hinder the peace process. Ultimately, Israelis and Palestinians will need to have the political will to make the necessary concessions required in order to achieve a durable peace. Given the enormous difficulties and complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Singapore's approach remains to be constructive, to be helpful, to support all efforts towards peace, and we will continue to support international efforts to create the necessary conditions that will enable this peace process to begin again. This was the key thrust of my remarks to the House on the 2nd of July 2024. Mr. Speaker, the safety and security of Singaporeans in the region, in the Middle East region, is our key concern. MFA has existing travel advisories against travel to Lebanon, and in particular the Israeli-Lebanon border, as well as the Israel-Syria border. But I have to inform the House that there is in fact one Singaporean currently e-registered in Lebanon who has insisted on proceeding with the trip, despite knowing the dangers. MFA will remain in close touch with all the Singaporeans who are e-registered in the region, and our embassy in Tel Aviv stands ready to provide consular assistance. All travelers to the Middle East are strongly encouraged to e-register with MFA, and please take precautions for personal safety.
Mr. Christopher D'Souza.
In the Minister's view, is this a political, social, or religious issue, or is it all three? And if it is all three, how will we ensure in Singapore that this foreign issue does not impact our social compact and social cohesion? Thank you.
Minister Balakrishnan.
This is a long-standing, complicated issue. You've mentioned that there may be a political, social, religious dimension. There will also be historical, cultural, geographical, and economic dimensions to it. Basically, there is no easy solution. There's also, unfortunately, no quick and instant solution. The main point which I think you are trying to raise is that given the complexities of the issue and the fact that this is going to be so long-standing, how should Singapore and Singaporeans respond? Given that we are multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious, we are an open city, we depend on free trade, we depend on the import of energy, and the point is that events far away can have profound impact on us. It can affect us economically. It can also affect our social, ethnic, religious harmony. And this is something which we need to be very, very mindful of. And therein the point is you have also made, this is a foreign issue. This is something far away, but we should not underestimate the impact that it can have on our society. And I think our paramount concern should be to maintain the unity and cohesion of all Singaporeans. That we're entitled to different opinions, different reactions even, but above all, maintain our own domestic cohesion and collectivity. And then we can play our role as a responsible member of the international community, standing for peace, standing for international law, upholding principles, providing humanitarian assistance wherever it is needed, and then maintaining our communication channels open with all parties, even though some of these parties may be at war or doing things which, quite frankly, we find abhorrent. So that's the position which I'm trying to encourage us to maintain. So far, you would have noticed that we have access to all parties. I've been to Palestine, I've been to Israel, I've been to the Middle East. You will also recall that so far Singaporeans have raised more than $17 million of assistance. And these funds have come from Singaporeans of all races, languages, and religion. And we've been able to work with our partners across the Middle East to deliver this assistance. So I hope members of this House will see that even in this dark hour, the unity of Singaporeans, the goodwill and generosity of Singaporeans, and the calm, measured, principled, consistent diplomatic posture of Singapore is something which has been noticed and appreciated, certainly in the Middle East, but even on the international stage. Thank you.
Mr. Alexiam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question for the Minister. I note that Minister shared that there's one Singaporean who's e-registered to travel to Lebanon and has decided to proceed. I also further note that there are one travel notice and two travel advisories dated 17 April, 14 April, and 7 February for the region. Should the first SQ is the Ministry aware of how many Singaporeans remain in the immediate vicinity of the region who are either registered or unregistered? And if the Ministry assesses the situation to become more serious, although this is rarely done, will MFA issue a stricter travel advisory for Singaporeans to completely avoid travel to the region?
Minister.
By definition, MFA will not be aware of Singaporeans who are in the region who have not e-registered with us. I've already mentioned we have at least one in Lebanon. We have several, I don't have the exact number, in Israel. I want to be quite categorical. Frankly, as far as MFA is concerned, it's not a matter of strict. We have signaled unambiguously through our travel advisories and notices, please don't go to hotspots where safety will be an issue, or where we anticipate that further regional conflagration is a real and present risk. And if that happens and you get into trouble, of course, we won't leave you behind, but you are actually generating enormous work and concern, and sometimes even risk to the officers in MFA. So, again, I make this appeal. Unless there's really, really no choice, please don't go, and please don't give us unnecessary extra work. And I say this not because my officers are not willing to do the work. My officers are. And I would also make this point that MFA has got offices throughout the Middle East. And I have never had a single officer come up to me and say, there is a clear and present risk, please don't send me. So I hope this House will also join me in expressing our appreciation and admiration for the Foreign Service officers who put themselves on the front lines, at risk, in order to represent us and to safeguard our interests and to help Singaporeans.
Mr. Long Man Wai.
Thank you, Speaker. The Foreign Minister had previously characterized the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a family quarrel. So I raised a question for the foreign minister that whether it is still appropriate to characterize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a family quarrel in light of the ICJ's advisory opinion. Thank you.
Minister.
I think we should never trivialize the tragedy that is unfolding there. Maybe for your edification, let me remind you of a speech which Senior Minister Lee made in November last year, and it's worth reading just one paragraph of that speech. And he says, quote, "We are also watching closely events in the Middle East. The re-eruption of the Israel-Palestinian conflict has impacted Singapore. Like people elsewhere in the world, Singaporeans identify with the plight of Palestinian people. Muslim Singaporeans especially feel this strongly. But in fact, all Singaporeans are appalled by the human suffering in Gaza as Israeli attacks target there, as they were also appalled by Hamas terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians on the 7th of October that prompted this IDF military operations. The quarrel between the Israelis and Palestinians is not our quarrel, but it impacts our society. The government has to take a national position that upholds our consistent principles and which considers the sentiments and feelings of our population. We feel sympathy for the civilian victims on both sides and will extend humanitarian help to those in need. But we must not let problems elsewhere widen fault lines in our society. Let us indeed build on and strengthen our social harmony." Unquote. So that's the context, Mr. Leong. Do not let problems elsewhere widen our potential fault lines. And none of us should seek to do that or take advantage of that for political point scoring. That is the real message to you. And indeed, it's a reminder to all of us. And again, as I said, we can all have different perspectives, views. We may be informed by religion, social conscience, our own interpretations of history. But the paramount point here, let us not be divided. Don't play up fault lines. And it is possible, and I hope in the fullness of time it will be shown, that Singapore is a mature, cohesive society that can deal with diversity and still rise up to the occasions, uphold principles, not take sides, be helpful, express the best part of our humanity and our compassion, whilst understanding that life is complicated, especially in many other places. And I think we can approach this with this spirit of humility and realism. I think we can be a useful exemplar to other parts of the world where these fault lines have not only cracked, but have led to enormous loss of life, and especially innocent lives of civilians. I think on that note, we are all completely united.
Mr. Gerald Giam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Minister has said that Singapore has access to all to many of the parties on all sides of the conflict. Does Singapore have any plans to play some role to bring together the different sides, even in some small way?
Minister?
Well, Mr. Giam accompanied me on my trip in March. So you will know that, yes, we do have access, and yes, they do listen politely to us because we've got long-standing relations, and they know we don't grandstand and we don't, engage in point seeking, and we're not engaged in a publicity exercise. But I think you would also agree from your trip with me that there is a very, very limited role for us. It's not a question of a venue for meeting or even offering good advice. They're not short of advice. And they're not actually short of venues to meet or avenues of communication. But until the top leaders in the two warring tribes can arrive at a conclusion that violence is not the answer, and that concessions are essential, and that these two related people have to learn to live with each other. Both peoples occupying contested land are not going to leave, and they will be a reality for each other till the end of time. It is that realization and that change in spirit and perspective that will be necessary. So I think as far as Singapore is concerned, we stay united, we help where we can, we uphold principles, and we insist on adherence to international law on all sides. I think our access is also because they know we are fair-minded people and that we're prepared to help wherever we can help. But let's not, overstep ourselves or assume that we've got a greater role than we can actually play. At the end, this is one little red dot, a shiny red dot, but we are still far away and many steps removed from them. I would also remind you when we went and there were discussions about one state and two state. And you will recall the conversation which I had with some senior people to say, well, if you want a one-state solution, your delegation must look like mine. Multi-religious, multiracial, and completely united, even across political boundaries. But I think you would have also got a sense from that trip that that is very far removed from the reality in the Middle East, at least for now. So again, I think this spirit of humility and consistency and upholding what is right whilst maintaining the unity amidst our great diversity, I think that alone is our contribution to show the world that it is possible to live in peace with your neighbor, with your brother.